Islam is a religion invented by men to feed the basest instincts of other men. Hey, you like violence? Join us. You can do it. All is good with that. You like women? You can have up to 4 wives and as many concubines as you want. Children, don't worry about it. You don't have to care for them. And guess what? If she's not willing, you can force her. And if she's not a Muslim, you can do to her whatever you want. This is Orthodox Islam. This is what Islam is. That's what October 7th was. That's what Rotherham was. That's what Islam is at its core. You cannot talk about Islam and not use the word art. Welcome to another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton. And I gotta say, I have been gone for what feels like forever, since almost the beginning of the year. I've been gone 5, 6 countries. I begin to lose track. Everything starts running together, bleeding together in a way that's hard for me to keep up with what is what. But I gotta tell you, I don't care how nice the hotel is that you're staying in. Nothing beats your own bed. Nothing is quite like coming home. So, Jonathan, good to see you. It's good to be back at my desk. It's good to be able to do a proper podcast. And some of the places that I've been, you've been following me for a while on things like, the first stop was the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. I had Data Republican with me. You may remember that. And then I went from there to Poland, from Poland to Israel, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Gaza. Then I was in Paris and the no-go zones there. Italy. I was in a lot of different places, and you're going to start reaping a lot of the benefits of that. These are research trips. Doesn't mean I don't have a little bit of fun, but for the most part, I am working and I'm trying to put boots on the ground in places so I can properly inform you about what's going on. Now, for a very long time, 2 years, I've said almost nothing about the war in Israel. Now, I did give some background to the history of the land, which I'm familiar with. I certainly, gave you kind of an inside picture of what was going on with USAID in Cairo. But as for the modern events of what was going on in Israel, what was taking place in Gaza and all the claims of stand down orders and genocide and on and on and on, I said nothing. And the reason is because I feel like I have to, if I'm to take seriously, in the sense of James chapter 3, my responsibility in teaching you, that means that I need to not only just do the book work, but when possible, I need to put boots on the ground. I need to put boots on the ground. And it's because I learned a very long time ago that it offers you a perspective that is lacking when you're just looking at books or when you're just looking at news articles. And as much as possible, if you can engage the principals, the people involved, Palestinians, which is what I was doing in part when I was in Egypt last year and, had that, that terrible what could have really turned into a fatal run-in with the Egyptian secret police. And then now to get the perspective of the IDF, of the Israelis in Israel. That's what I was there to do. And I have to tell you, it has a massive impact on the way you interpret events. But one of the things that I really want to stress to you today, which may feel to you a little esoteric at the beginning, but then you're going to start to realize how important this is. Now, when I was a student of history, getting my bachelor's, my graduate degree in the study of history, interestingly enough, I had one professor, and only one, who stressed the importance of geography in determining a nation's history, what that history looks like, how a country develops. And for me to tell you this today, as I do, it's going to be almost like I'm revealing to you how a magic trick is done. And whenever a magician does that, it always gives us the feeling that we knew it all along, because it's usually quite obvious, isn't it? When the magic trick is finally revealed and you see the wire, or you see that there was, some sleight of hand or something that you initially missed, now it seems so obvious to you that you almost convince yourself, well, I always knew that. And that's what this episode is going to be a bit like, except you didn't know it. Now, the professor in question is worth you looking up. He was a man by the name of Michael Richard Daniel Foote, no E on the end of Foote, F-O-O-T. M.R.D. Foote was the name that he went by. And do not confuse him with M.D.R. Foote with an E on the end, who was a parliamentarian, a British parliamentarian. But M.R.D. Foote, Michael Richard Daniel Foote, was a graduate of Oxford University. He was a professor of history at Oxford University, a mentor to me, and passed away in 2019. Only man, by the way, to ever be mentioned by his real name in a John le Carré novel. And that is because Michael Richard Daniel Foote was sort of famous for writing the history of espionage, British espionage. And he himself had been a member of the SOE, Special Operations Executive, had spent a fair amount of time in a prison camp, but that's a whole different topic for today. But he used to always say that geography is a massive influence on the development of a country's history. And he's absolutely correct. And the reason for that is, if you just think, just practically for just a moment, a nation without resources, say like Japan, is sent in search of them. This is what led to, the Japanese invasion of continental Asia, Manchuria in 1933, China, all in search of natural resources, which Japan itself did not possess. Some countries have marvelous, natural boundaries behind which they can take refuge. Switzerland, for example. Some countries have virtually none, like, say, Belgium or Holland, the Netherlands, or Ukraine. And the result of that is that they are frequently find themselves being the doormat of invading armies. The United States has been blessed with, and we sing, God shed his grace on thee. It is so true when we were talking about the United States. Now, it's only true if the United States is in fact united. If Nebraska, Kansas, let's say, were countries unto themselves, it'd be a different story, because they're plain states. They have no natural boundaries behind which to take refuge, and it becomes very indefensible. But as united states, America has arguably the greatest geography on earth. The French could claim that they owned what became part of the Louisiana Purchase all they wanted. They certainly were a much greater military power at the time, the Napoleonic era, than the United States was. However, while Napoleon might claim that he owned that land, he also recognized Americans were moving onto it and building log cabins on it. Better sell now while we can. Get some hard currency before we just lose it to squatters. That's what was happening. The United States has been blessed with two marvelous anti-tank ditches known as the Atlantic and the Pacific. As a result, in World Wars I and II, we could enter those wars virtually at leisure. The Belgians, the French, the Dutch, the Russians, they didn't have those options. They didn't. And that was because they found that they were fighting wars, world wars, in their backyards. The United States didn't have that. The British, until the British started importing their own invaders, it had been since 1066. 1066 was the last successful cross-channel invasion. That 20-mile moat separating the British Isles from continental Europe has served to protect Britain for millennia. A millennia. protecting it from invaders. Even though the British barely had an army in World War II, Hitler could never really launch Operation Sea Lion, the plan to invade Britain. And that was because he never gained mastery of the air, and he knew the losses were going to be staggering in crossing the English Channel. So again, I'm stressing to you the importance of geography, because geography determines almost everything. Now, this is by way of explaining to you. I'm going to set this over here, and I'm going to put a map on my desk, and I'm going to explain to you something that I feel is lost in the discussion of the war between Israel and Gaza. And of course is now, extended to include, others, Iran being a primary participant here. But, Iran's been a primary participant for quite some time because they were training Hamas, they were supplying Hamas, they were giving Hamas not just weapons, but the technological know-how to break through the so-called wall of iron, the fence, the border fence going around Gaza. Now, let's just take a second to look at this map, and let me explain to you. This isn't, you don't have to be pro-Israel. You be pro-Hamas for this to make sense. What I'm going to say to you makes sense. And by the way, I really do want to point this out. My support for Israel in this war, I keep seeing all of these discussions on social media about dispensationalism. If you're not familiar with dispensationalism, dispensationalism is a school of Protestant theology that interprets the Bible into periods, dispensations, where God works differently in each one. And people who are in favor of that worldview, my father-in-law, most notably, he was a seminary graduate. He was a thoughtful man, certainly very learned in Scripture. He was a very strong believer in dispensationalism. Now, I'm not so much. And so the two of us would have some very lively discussions about these things. But you will see discussions about this and in reference to what is known as covenant or reformed theology that comes up quite a lot. And those two schools of thought have very different understandings of what the modern state of Israel represents. Some see it as God's chosen people in the literal sense that they are God's chosen people. Other people say, well, no, God's chosen people are the ones who have repented and have become Christians. So if you are an adherent of any other religion, you follow any other God, you're lost. And therefore, you're not one of God's chosen people. That's a very oversimplified view of what these two schools of thought see and think as it relates to Israel. I want to push all of that aside for a moment and simply say this. I think most people get lost in the weeds of those discussions. That's a discussion I'd be happy to have. I'd have to devote several episodes, to explaining those two theological schools. And there are other, different schools of thought too that are sometimes a little bit of a mix of the two. But you're seeing people who are adherents to these schools of thought really digging in their heels, and as often is the case in these kinds of arguments, you start getting a little bit more shrill and a little bit more extreme in expressing what it is that you believe, because you're reacting against, the other guy. I want to save you a little bit of trouble as it relates to this without digging my heels in on either side of that. What has happened in Israel, the October 7th, 2023 attacks on Israel, you don't need a theological framework like dispensationalism in order to support Israel. You are, I think, missing the point if you're an and some people are anti-dispensationalist, and therefore you're against Israel just because you don't like these people over here that you're arguing with. This is much simpler, biblically speaking. You do not need one of those frameworks to come to the conclusion that October 7th was a very, very evil and vile act of war, as I have stressed elsewhere. It wasn't just an attack on a Woodstock like outdoor music festival. Isolated, terrible, but really Israel's response has been disproportionate. That's the way some people see it. No, it was an act of war. 1,200 Israelis were killed. And I also recognize the fact there will be people who will drop into the comments here and say vile things, always revealing themselves to be anti-Semites. They come in and they just hate Jews because they're Jews. They just hate them. And they come up with all these bizarre ideas that they control the world. If they control the world, why do they not control October 7th? Some of you say, oh, but they did. There was a stand down order. All complete nonsense. October 7th was an awful, evil, vile event. And if you find yourself, here's the simplicity of this, breaking it down to this. If you're on the same side of Ilhan Omar, if you're on the same side as AOC, if you find yourself on the same side as Sinwar, who planned the attacks, a man who has spent more than half of his adult life in Israeli prisons for the 12 people that he admitted to, and I'm sure he more, one of whom he poured boiling oil over his head. If you're on the same side as vile individuals like this, you need to check your moral GPS because you are in the wrong ideological neighborhood. Or maybe you're in the right one. Maybe you're in the right one because that's just the kind of person you are. But if you are that kind of person, get off my channel. Unsubscribe, unfollow me, block me. I don't want you. I don't want you in my wake. I don't want to see your comments. You will be blocked. Because if your comments are vile, if you demonstrate that you're a vile individual, we won't have you on here. We just won't. This isn't Tucker Carlson. We don't just platform vile people. We don't do that. We don't allow those kinds of things to be promoted and to be pushed. To clarify, you don't have to agree with me. That's okay. You can disagree. If you do so respectfully and your reasoning, you offer, something of a real argument. But if you're just coming on and name calling and you're obviously some kind of race baiter, not interested in having you on here. Now, let's put a map of Israel right here while I explain to you why the geography is so important. All right. Okay. You can see the map that I've drawn out here for you of the Middle East, and I've given a double highlight to the borders of modern Israel. Now, when we speak of Israel, and particularly when we speak of it biblically, we're usually talking about Israel as, the promised land. Well, in terms of its defensibility, this is terrible land. I'm not talking about how arable it is. I'm not talking about the beauty of it or lack thereof, according to Tucker Carlson. I'm not talking about any of that. I'm just talking about it from a strategic, defensible point of view. Now, first of all, obviously, I've blown up Israel on here to make it look much larger, but Israel is tiny. It's a speck in a sea surrounded by Arab, that is to say, Muslim countries, the vast majority of which are very hostile to Israel and the desire to, of course, wipe it off the face of the earth. Now, what I've also given you a picture of here is you see Gaza right here, and then this is the West Bank. So right inside Israel itself, the Israelis are dealing with hostiles. Both of these are controlled by the Palestinian Authority. And so it's the reason why. There are other reasons, but one of the reasons why other Arab countries are not interested in taking refugees from Gaza is because they want to keep them right where they are. They want to keep them right where they are because so long as they're there, they're a thorn in the side of the Israelis, and it forever puts Israel on the defensive, geographically speaking, because they have a population of 1 to 2 million people in Gaza alone who are hostile to them. And from an Israeli point of view, and the Arab countries know this very well, any settlement of the Israel-Gaza war that leaves a single Gazan in Gaza is a net loss for the Israelis. Arab countries know this, and hence they want to keep them there. So on the border with Egypt, some of you have seen the wall that the Egyptians have built. They have built a very formidable border wall. Now, their border wall with Gaza is only 7 miles, whereas the Israelis have a border wall of, I think, roughly 40 miles. They have much more that they have to defend with Gaza than, say, does Egypt. But Egypt's border, at least above ground, they don't want any Palestinians. They want to keep them out. And part of the reason for that is because Hamas is the military wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood was who I ran into in Cairo, who is running the USAID compound there. And General Sisi, the president of Egypt, he sees the Muslim Brotherhood as allies against Israel, but as hostiles concerning his own government. He does not want them because they may try to overthrow the government. They have tried to overthrow the government. And they did the same thing, in other border states. So that's another reason why some of these Arab countries don't want them, but also because, again, they want to keep them exactly where they are. Now, where Israel is concerned here, also consider the fact that you're not talking about that they have in the north, say, the Alps, and then they have here, something like the English Channel, and then down here in the south are the Himalayas, and thus the Israelis are superbly defended. They're not. This isn't Switzerland. The Swiss have been able to avoid participation in world wars because it was too hard to invade Switzerland. So they declared themselves a neutral, and while there was discussions on the part of Hitler's government to invade, they decided it was too costly an endeavor. It just simply wasn't worth it. Israel's completely different. Israel can be easily invaded from almost any direction. And you have also the Mediterranean Sea. So there's the potential of invasion from the sea itself. And on October 7th, the Gazans themselves Hamas used boats to invade Israel. And then they invaded from no less than 109 spots all along the frontier. And they came by powered what are they called? Paragliders. They came by golf cart. They came by cars. They came by motorcycles, by trucks, by bicycles, you name it. They came over the fence and they came through the fence. They didn't come under it. There's no evidence that they used the tunnels, which is what the Israelis were pretty sure they were going to do. But they also came by boat. Now, down here in the south, again, I say that the Egyptian border is very well defended, except for underneath it. And that's because tunnels that are running from Egypt into Gaza are used to supply it. And this is how a lot of the weapons were getting into Gaza in the first place. Weapons from North Korea, weapons from China, vehicles from China. These tunnels are quite substantial. From Iran, it was all making its way into Israel from Egypt. And General Sisi can claim that he doesn't really know about this or they're trying to prevent this. These tunnels are not that difficult to locate. And that's because we're not talking about that this right here is the Amazon and that there's this canopy that satellites can't penetrate through. This is desert. Holes in the ground are not that easy to hide. So they know very well what's going on here. So they give kind of a pretense that they're trying to prevent weapons and so forth from going in here, but they're really doing very little of that. And again, above ground, keeping the people of Gaza in Gaza, below ground, supplying them. So that's what's going on there. So Israel finds itself, Israel, a nation of, what is the population of Israel? I think about 10 million. You can verify me on that. Nation of roughly 10 million, easily outnumbered and outmaneuvered by these other countries in terms of their size. Now, one member of the IDF said to me, I don't care whether the United States supports this or not. I just want them to stay out of the war. My response was to say, I think you're wrong. Israel ceases to exist without the support of the United States. And this person kind of reluctantly acknowledged that what I was saying was true, that without U.S. technology, without U.S. weaponry, without U.S. ammunition, Israel simply ceases to exist because it's a very small population. Now, I said to you just a few minutes ago that I wasn't supporting Israel because of any particular big theological school of thought. I'm supporting Israel for another biblical purpose, and that's good versus evil. October 7th was an act of evil. Have the Israelis not done anything evil? Well, of course they have. They're human beings. We're all just my own country. The United States has done some very, very evil things, particularly under Democrat leadership. I would certainly put abortion, as something that falls into that category, and irreversible sex change operations, Joseph Mengele type stuff also falls into that category. So I'm not claiming that the United States or Israel themselves are pristine, morally speaking, and thus without any guilt whatsoever. Simply not true. But Israel is a Western nation, not geographically, but culturally speaking. And it is the Middle East's only democracy. And I see it as a part of America First to support Israel because they're our only real ally in this region. Historically, the United States has seen Israel as the cornerstone of any sensible Middle Eastern policy. So you can see that the geography here is not favorable to Israel at all. And so when we say that it's the promised land, not a promised land in terms of its defensibility, not at all. And Israel is incredibly vulnerable. And I got to tell you, when I was moving up and down what they call Burma, Burma is the border fence road where the invasion, occurred. The IDF was giving me special forces were giving me a battlefield tour of the October 7th attack. I kept thinking to myself as we're driving along that border fence that it was insufficiently guarded. There just were not enough men they're dispersed at such irregular, distant positions that it makes defense of the border fence even harder. And that has to do with the fact that on October 7th, and I think this is true of almost every Western nation, maybe it's true of, say, China or Russia as well. I don't know, but I think that there is an over-reliance on technology. There was an assumption on October 7th that their wall of iron, the border fence, was so superbly built with underground sensors and above ground sensors and surveillance and the use of drones that they would know there was an invasion coming before it happened. And guess what? They didn't. They had some indicators. But they were indicators that it happened again and again and again. And that's because what Hamas did, which was brilliant on their part, was that they were feigning attacks again and again and again. And the object was to lull the Israelis to sleep, to go, the lighting up of SIM cards, this has happened before. This is some kind of training exercise. They're not invading. Well, guess what they did? And so if you're on the side of Hamas, if you're on the side of Islam, you are on the wrong side. You just are. So as you can see, geography is very significant in determining the history of your country. And the Israelis have some of the worst geography on the face of the earth, given the fact, again, this is not a commentary on the quality of the land or the beauty of it or lack of it. That's not what I'm talking about. And its defensibility wouldn't be an issue were they surrounded by, say, countries that are like-minded and where the threat of invasion weren't constant. But the fact is, the threat of invasion is constant for the Israelis. Hence the reason there's compulsory military service. Hence the reason that Israel depends on the United States very heavily for its own military industrial complex, and why they're trying to build their own. They're trying to build one that is independent of the United States. Therefore, they're not so vulnerable going from, say, a Trump administration to a Biden administration, back to a Trump administration to who knows what. Israel realizes, those in the know realize that their defense depends entirely upon the United States. Or let me rephrase that, not entirely, it depends largely upon the United States. And the Israelis are also recognizing the fact that, that their reliance on the U.S., which for decades they have been able to take for granted that the United States would be benevolent, would be their partner, that no longer can be taken for granted. And why is that? Well, it's for two primary reasons. It is because Arabs, that is to say Muslim countries, but Arabs are learning to use their money to influence public opinion in the West. They've never found a Benjamin Netanyahu, anybody with his level of charisma and his ability to think on his toes, how articulate he is in television, in debate. They've never had that guy. I'm sure they're hoping that Mondani will be that individual for them, but I don't think so. So they've never found that, but they have found that their money, in spite of that they're able to buy universities, they're able to buy media influence, and they're also able to buy influencers. Now, what is happening? There's all kinds of discussion about what's happening with individuals like Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson and now Megyn Kelly. What is happening with these people? We can speculate about that all day long, and I'm not sure that I find it particularly helpful. Instead, I prefer to focus on what they are or are not saying and how truthful it is. There was a time where I would have said that both Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens and Megyn Kelly too were just naive individuals who just didn't seem to know any better. Now what we're seeing is just sheer evil. Some of the stuff is just, where you're telling lies and you're telling lies, where just a complete lack of integrity. That's what I'm seeing happening there. And where there's not really a desire to engage with people who actually are in the know. So what do? You bring on pseudo historians. You platform people whose views. It's only until Mike Huckabee really has, and he got schooled. Only with Mike Huckabee has Tucker Carlson really engaged with somebody who actually disagrees with him and can push back at his arguments. Otherwise, he's time and time again platforming individuals who agree with him and who will push the narrative that he wants. Those are the things that you are seeing happening. There's no real honesty in engaging on these issues. So am I one of these individuals? Am I one of these Christians who believes that we have to support Israel no matter what? No, I don't hold that view. I don't agree with every decision that my own government makes, much less those that the Israeli government makes. However, that said, in the macro, I am on the side of the Israelis. I can look and see that these are a people who are besieged from all sides by an evil ideology. I can see that they are surrounded by people who want to kill them simply because they're Jews. And that's not my lived experience, and it's probably not yours. As you're listening here, listen, there's been 2 attempts on my life in the last year. People who follow Ideas Have Consequences know this. But it wasn't because I'm a white man or because I am a Protestant or something like that. It was because somebody didn't like what I was saying. It's because somebody didn't like me for ideological reasons, deemed me to be a threat, and decided they wanted to eliminate me for that reason. The Jewish experience is wholly different, where there are individuals who want to, and by the way, you have to make the distinction between Islam and Judaism in this regard. Islam is not an ethnicity. Now, it is overwhelmingly, made up of Arabs, but not exclusively so. I mean, the largest The largest Muslim majority country in the world is in Indonesia. So it's not just Arabs. There are white Muslims, not tons, but there are white Muslims. That number is growing. There are black Muslims. There are Asian Muslims. Islam is an ideology. It is not an ethnicity. Judaism can be both. That is to say, there are people who are not ethnically Jewish, but become religiously, they choose to become Jewish. I don't encounter a lot of that. I've encountered many people who have converted to Christianity. I've made a few with the help of the Holy Spirit in my lifetime. I've known some people who have converted to Islam, and I've known some people who have deconverted from both Christianity and Islam. But until I was in Israel on this particular trip, I had never met someone who had converted to Judaism. It's the first time I'd encountered that. And that in part is because Judaism isn't evangelical. They're not seeking to make converts the way Christianity does and the way Islam does, which is generally done with the sword in Islam. So there is an aspect of Judaism that we're talking about it as a religion, not as an ethnicity. But in almost every single instance we're talking about it, we're referring to Jews. We're talking about an ethnic group. And so to hate people for their ethnicity is evil. It's just evil. And I find myself on the side of the underdog time and time again. And Israel here is the underdog. That's just a fact of the matter. And there are people who are fighting for their existence, their right to exist. And I keep seeing all these comments. They crack me up because, again, they're so dumb. They're so uneducated. Is people talking about Zionism. You're a Christian Zionist. I'm against Zionism. Like Zionism or Nazism. Zionism, all Zionism is the belief that Jews deserve their own homeland. That's all it is. So you people who start talking about Third Temple and all this kind of nonsense, that's not Zionism. You're talking about something completely different, and it's made up. It's false. It's fake. Zionism is simply the belief that the Jewish people deserve their own homeland. The British government believed that. Winston Churchill believed that. Consecutive United States governments have believed that. I believe that. I believe they deserve to have their own homeland, and I believe it's their own historic homeland that predated any kind of people called Palestinians. That's just a fact of history. It's simply a fact of history. So we have to understand and make the distinction between Islam as an ideology and the Jewish people as an ethnicity. There are plenty of Jews who are not religious. Most Jews that I've met in the United States aren't. And it's a very interesting thing because often in the United States, what you find are Jewish people who are very left-wing and even anti-Israel. It's kind of weird. And then you find something very different in Israel where, and there's not to say there aren't left-wingers in Israel, there certainly are, and their left wing and our left wing walk in lockstep, as does the French left wing and the British left wing. They're globalist everywhere. But you find far more conservative Jews in Israel than you do in the United States. And that's for a very good reason. And part of that has to do with their own historic experiences. Most of the Jews that I've encountered in the United States, I haven't seen data on this, but who are left-wing, and you would think to yourself, why in the world are you voting for Obama and Biden, who are clearly hostile to Israel? Wouldn't you as a Jew be faithful to that? No, they don't feel that way at all. How could you possibly be a Democrat and a Jew? Doesn't make much sense to me. And it was in Israel that somebody explained it to me. I said, how do you explain why so many Jewish people in the United States are Democrats and are hardcore leftists and not And you don't encounter nearly as much of that in Israel. And he said the answer to that has to do with our historical experiences. The people, the Jews residing in Israel overwhelmingly are descendants of Holocaust survivors. Those in the United States had settled in the United States long before the Holocaust. The Holocaust is not part of their historical experience, and they want to distance themselves from Judaism and from Jews. They have assimilated into U.S. culture, and they don't want to be associated with that. So what do? They adopt an extreme anti-Israel, even a weirdly anti-Semitic position. It's very odd. I've had conversations about this with Melanie Phillips. Melanie Phillips, who you're starting to see some clips of her on social media. She wrote for the Times of London. She now writes for the Jerusalem Post in Jerusalem. To read Melanie Phillips feels like I'm reading Francis Schaeffer. It feels like I'm reading a very intelligent, conservative Christian. Melanie's Jewish. And she left London because she didn't feel safe there anymore. And that's because she was getting death threats from people because she's Jewish. And she was sounding the alarm about things like Rotherham, which was the trafficking of at last count, roughly 250,000 British white girls. We're going to be suppressed, something terrible on here. Jonathan and I were talking about this before the show. How Ideas Have Consequences is so suppressed on YouTube. I mean, we're just choked on YouTube. And we both come to the conclusion that the issues that we talk about here require you to talk about some very unhappy things. And thus, I must, every episode, hit the do not say lexicon. It's like YouTube has a book of words you're not to say, and Larry Taunton goes bing, 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 bing. How can you even begin to talk about Islam? Probably another thing you're not allowed to talk about, and not use that word. How can you talk about Islam? I've decided that you cannot talk about Islam and not use the word RAPE in some form. You just can't. That's what October 7th was. That's what Rotherham was. That's what Islam is at its core. Islam is a religion invented by men to feed the basest instincts of other men. Hey, you like violence? Join us. You can do it. All is good with that. You like women? You can have up to 4 wives and as many concubines as you want. Children, don't worry about it. You don't have to care for them. And guess what? If she's not willing, you can force her. And if she's not a Muslim, you can do to her whatever you want. This is Orthodox Islam. This is what Islam is. And I hate the ideology, probably another word, another phrase I'm not supposed to use here on the show. I hate the ideology. John Lennox, a dear friend of mine, has been something of a mentor to me for many years. But I remember when we first started engaging in high-level academic debates with atheists, he used to always make the distinction between hating the ideology and the man. Insofar as we're able to make those distinctions, we want to make those distinctions. My point here isn't that every Muslim is a terrorist or would be terrorist. Many Muslims know very well what their own religion teaches, and they seek to stay away from it, and thus they are culturally Muslim. They just, kind of go through the motions of it without ever really believing it, kind of like Methodists. I can never resist that shot. And if it makes you mad, too bad. I first began attending church in a Methodist church. So I was once a Methodist. I came to Christ in a Methodist church. But the pastor of my church was like an old Baptist preacher. He preached fire and brimstone at least twice a month. and scared me to death. I must have repented 100 times. He was just like an old country Baptist preacher. He didn't have a college degree, got his GED. And he was a man with old gnarled hands who'd worked the railroad in the 1930s and the 1940s. An old man by the time I came along. He came into my life in the late 70s when I was, 12, 13 years old. Got to know him quite well. He had quite an impact on my life. Everybody called him Preach. That was his nickname, Preach. But he was like an old Baptist preacher. Buddy, he believed in sin and he believed in hell. I do too. There's some people who don't take their holy scriptures particularly seriously, and we may thank God for that when we are talking about the religion that I am referring to, the people living in your midst who don't take it particularly seriously. Problem is when they do. The problem is when they do. So as it relates to this topic that we're discussing here today, it's very easy for me to come down on the side of Israel. I don't need to be a dispensationalist to get there. It's a moral issue. And it's a pretty simple moral issue for me. And having engaged with both the Palestinians in Egypt and with the Israelis in Israel, of course, in Egypt, there was an effort to prevent me from seeing anything, to prevent me from taking video of anything, pictures of anything, from getting out of the frickin' country. In Israel, there was no effort whatsoever to control the narrative. They had no idea what I was going to write. None whatsoever. There was no effort to prevent me from seeing anything that I asked to see. There wasn't an effort to control the narrative. They just hoped I was going to be honest in the way I dealt with the manner in which they answered the questions that I asked. So to me, this is a very simple issue. But unless you understand the geography of Israel, you have a hard time understanding what's happening here. Gaza is to Israel what California is to the United States in terms of its size. Imagine if California was a kind of permanent Okinawa or Iwo Jima, tunneled. Online, I see that Gaza is said to have 350 miles of tunnels. Huckabee said more than 500 miles. I don't know which one is true. They probably can't know that, but a lot. Just like Okinawa, I've climbed Hacksaw Ridge. I've been there. I've seen where American blood was spilled. I went through those tunnels that they shelled in what the Okinawans themselves referred to as the typhoon of steel. They shelled them for days before putting the first Marine on Okinawa, and guess what? The Japanese were still there. They went underground during the shelling, and then they came out. The Navy's firing upon the island barely left a tree standing, but it didn't penetrate into those tunnels. And the same is happening now in Gaza. And the Israelis are forever on the defensive because Gaza has and will always be used against them as a base of operation. Jews. Jews. Ask yourself this. Let's just take Judaism out of it. Let's just suppose that this country that we call Israel was populated by Dutch, who were irreligious. Let's just say that. My feelings would remain exactly the same. I would say we have to support the Dutch. We have to support these people against this evil religion that seeks just to people because they're Dutch. We can't allow that. We can't allow this. We can't allow these kinds of atrocities to take place. Not if we have any kind of conscience. I'm going to be telling you a lot more about this in weeks and days to come, because there's a lot that I gleaned on this particular trip. But driving with the IDF along Burma, along the border fence, I just come away thinking to myself, and I'm sure they don't like me saying this, it's vulnerable. And it's because it's a vast border, given Israel's population, given Israel's size. How in the world did you defend against that? Technology wasn't enough. Boots on the ground, there was not enough of them. So I think Israel remains very vulnerable to attack. Now, as I close, I want to point this out to you right here. Can you see it? We have these on the Larry Taunton store. LarryAlexTauntonStore.com. LarryAlexTauntonStore.com. You can get these America pins. We also have one that's half British, that is Union Jack on one side and the American flag on the other. And that's for another show that I do that's called WTF, World of Taunton and Fox, myself and Lawrence Fox. He's British, I'm American. So we sell those pins on there as well. They're not expensive, but this is just a little way of showing your patriotism. It's just a little way of saying, I love my country. I do love my country. And so get one of these and support the work that I do here on this show. At the same time, we also have these coffee mugs right here, and they have different designs on them. This one right here says, Larry Alex Taunton, your man in the field. We also have one that says, ideas have consequences. And I got to tell you this. I designed these mugs. That is to say, I chose the mugs that I wanted us to have because I don't like the kind of generic mug that's sort of out there that you go on a mission trip and you get the generic mug. Nobody ever uses those. I wanted a quality mug with a quality handle that you can get a couple of fingers in, and that, is one you're going to use. These are quality. They're made by Deneen Pottery, which is, they're making some things that are now collectible. But again, you can find these on LarryAlexTauntonStore.com. And you can also go in there and find my books. This is Around the World in More Than 80 Days, but I've also written a couple of other books that I hope that you will buy and find very useful. Support the work that we do here. The kinds of things that I'm providing for you on the show are expensive. Doing the kind of traveling I just did, incredibly expensive, so that I can inform you, so that I can hopefully lead you towards truth. This has been another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton.